The Galactic Educational Summit expected delegations of 50 beings from every world. Earth sent one woman. When Commander Vex 9 asked what subject she taught, her single-word answer made the entire station fall silent. Survival. This isn't about advanced theories or polished systems, it's about what happens when everything goes wrong. And in this universe, things go wrong a lot. The first time I saw Dr. Elena Vasquez enter the summit chamber, I thought there'd been an administrative error. I checked my datapad twice. Commander Vex 9 and Chancellor Zorp Alpha stood center stage flanked by their 50-member delegations, each being polished and perfect in ceremonial silks and polished exoskeletons. The Vegans shimmered in light-repelling robes. The Andromedans stood with perfect biomechanical posture. The Zenturi delegates glowed with subtle internal illumination. It was exactly what you'd expect from the galaxy's foremost educational institutions. Then this human woman walked in alone. No entourage. No ceremonial garments. She wore simple Earth-made clothing, durable fabric in muted colors, practical boots that made no sound on the polished floor. The translation matrix flickered as it processed her greeting. The system struggled with the simplicity. "Hello, my name is Elena Vasquez." 7 words. No titles. No institutional affiliations. Just a name and a greeting. I watched the Andromedan scholars exchange confused glances. Their antennae twitched in perfect unison. This wasn't how prestigious educators presented themselves. The Zenturi delegation actually chuckled behind their data slates, their laugh units emitting soft, condescending chimes. They assumed Earth had sent some low-level functionary, maybe a junior administrator who'd gotten lost on the way to a supplies conference. But her posture told a different story. She stood like someone who expected the floor to give way at any moment. Weight balanced evenly, knees slightly bent, eyes constantly tracking the room without seeming to move her head. She didn't look impressed by the glittering delegations. She looked like she was assessing structural weaknesses and exit routes. That's when Commander Vex 9 asked the question that would change everything. His voice modulator emitted the standard diplomatic cadence. "What subject do you represent?" He expected to hear about quantum pedagogy or neural integration techniques or molecular synthesis theory. Her one-word answer didn't just silence the room. It broke their entire framework of what education meant: survival. The translation matrix didn't even need to process it. The word existed in every language in the galaxy, but nobody had ever spoken it in this context before. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was the sound of centuries of assumptions crumbling. I watched Chancellor Zorp Alpha's facial plates actually shift color. The Vegans stopped shimmering. The Zenturi's internal lights dimmed. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed except the human woman, who kept breathing like this was perfectly normal. Before Elena spoke, I had never questioned our educational perfection. The Vegan delegation had just finished demonstrating their neural integration techniques, projecting complex thought patterns that shimmered in the air like captured lightning. The Andromedans followed with quantum calculation academies, showing students who could solve equations in 11 dimensions before their first growth cycle. Each presentation was flawless, polished, and utterly dependent on conditions that don't exist outside simulation chambers. I watched Chancellor Zorp Alpha nod approvingly at the Zenturi molecular purification display. Their system used phased energy fields to separate contaminants at the atomic level. The demonstration unit alone cost more than some planets' annual budgets. It needed constant power from the station grid, required monthly calibration by certified technicians, and could only function within a 2-degree temperature range. Beautiful engineering. Completely useless when things went wrong. That's when Elena stood up. She didn't approach the podium like the others. She just rose from her seat and stood there, looking at us like we were children who'd never been hungry. Her eyes scanned the room not with admiration, but with assessment. She was counting power conduits, measuring door widths, noting ventilation shafts. "All of your beautiful, sophisticated educational systems have one thing in common," she said. Her voice didn't carry the modulated perfection of the translation systems. It sounded like someone who'd shouted over wind and machinery. "They assume a safe, stable environment." The room got cold. Literally cold. The environmental systems must have glitched because I felt the temperature drop several degrees. She wasn't just criticizing their methods, she was questioning their entire reality. The Vegan delegates actually pulled their robes tighter. The Andromedan's mechanical components emitted soft stress hums. I watched the Centauri engineer who'd presented the purification system start to protest, then stop. His mouth opened but no sound came out. What could he say? His entire career, his life's work, assumed continuous power, spare parts availability, technical support teams on standby. He'd never considered what happens when the backup generators fail. In this universe, Elena said, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. Things go wrong. They go wrong a lot. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Every being in that room knew about supernova radiation bursts, quantum cascade failures, pirate blockades, and system-wide power collapses. We just never connected those realities to our educational philosophies. Suddenly, all their perfect systems looked fragile. The shimmering thought patterns seemed like pretty lights that would vanish when the power failed. The quantum calculations became abstract puzzles with no practical application in a crisis. The molecular purifier transformed from technological marvel into expensive paperweight. The room full of the galaxy's greatest educators had built magnificent castles on foundations of sand, and one human woman had just pointed out the incoming tide. Then she told us about the children. The room was still processing her statement about things going wrong when she shifted from theory to concrete example. 3 months ago, Elena began, her voice losing none of its steady calm. I was teaching a class in South Sudan. She didn't elaborate on where that was or why it mattered. She assumed we could access planetary databases if we cared. She described 26 students ages 8 to 16, learning water purification techniques using local materials. They were constructing simple filters from layered sand, charcoal, and cloth when gunfire erupted outside the building. Not target practice, not celebration fire. Combat weapons. Close range. I watched the Vegans physically recoil. Their children never experience violence. Their young learn in climate-controlled environments with panic buttons that summon immediate security response. The concept of learning while under threat was alien to them. Literally alien. Elena didn't describe panic. She described procedure. The students immediately extinguished their small heating element. They moved the younger children to the reinforced corner they'd identified during their first class. They used their half-finished water filters as structural elements, combining them with desks and textbooks to create concealment barriers. Older students positioned themselves at windows to monitor the situation, while others established 3 separate escape routes based on their weekly evacuation drills. That's when she said the words that haunted me. They knew what to do because survival isn't just a subject I teach. It's a mindset. Her voice carried no pride, no drama. She stated it as simple fact. These children didn't think about heroism or fear. They thought about angles of cover, evacuation timing, and protecting the most vulnerable. The Centauri ambassador opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. His facial lighting flickered in what I recognized as distress simulation. What could he say? His students would have died. They would have waited for automated security systems that didn't exist. They would have followed protocols designed for laboratory accidents, not armed conflict. They might have composed perfect essays on conflict theory while bullets tore through the walls. These Earth children, using scraps and basic knowledge, survived because they'd been taught how things actually go wrong. Not theoretical failures in controlled systems, but the messy, unpredictable collapse of normalcy. They didn't just learn about water purification, they learned how to purify water when someone might be shooting at them. The difference was profound. It was the difference between knowing something and being able to use that knowledge when everything falls apart. The room stayed silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of offended dignity, but the silence of comprehension. The vegan delegates had stopped shimmering entirely. The Andromedan's mechanical components had gone completely still. They were all picturing their own educational facilities, their own students, and realizing how terribly vulnerable they all were. How all their advanced systems assumed a world that doesn't exist, while this human woman taught for the world that actually does. Then she brought out the filters. Elena reached into her simple cloth bag and placed 2 devices on the presentation table. The first was the Centauri molecular purification system that had been demonstrated earlier. Sleek metallic casing, glowing blue light indicators, silent humming that suggested immense power restrained. It looked like something from a high-budget engineering exhibition. The second device was a messy collection of sand, charcoal, and cloth layers packed into a plastic container. It looked like something someone had assembled from scavenged materials. The contrast was almost painful to witness. She didn't need to introduce either device. Everyone recognized the Zenturi unit from the earlier presentation. Nobody recognized the homemade contraption, though a few delegates leaned forward with expressions of restrained disgust. The Vegan scholars actually pulled back slightly, their robes shifting away from the primitive-looking object. Elena looked from one device to the other, then at the assembled delegates. Her expression remained neutral, professional. Then she asked 3 questions that shattered the room. Her voice carried clearly without amplification. Which one works when the power goes out? Which one works when you don't have 20,000 credits? Which one works when the certified technician isn't available? Each question hung in the air like a physical blow. I watched the Zenturi engineer who'd presented the advanced system actually stand up. His posture showed professional offense, his internal lighting pulsing with agitated patterns. But ours is more efficient, he protested. It purifies water to 7 additional decimal places. It removes contaminants your primitive device cannot even detect. Elena just smiled. Not a condescending smile, but the kind of smile someone gives when stating an obvious truth. Efficiency doesn't matter if you can't use it, she said. Her tone suggested this should be self-evident. The engineer stood there, his protest hanging uselessly in the air. That's when she dropped the cost comparison. 2 credits for the materials in this filter, she said, tapping the homemade device. 20,000 credits for your purification system, not including maintenance contracts, power consumption, or replacement filters. The numbers hung in the air, stark and undeniable. The Vegan delegation started whispering urgently among themselves. I caught fragments of their hushed conversation. Their water systems had similar vulnerabilities. Their atmospheric processors required even more specialized technicians. Their entire life support infrastructure depended on constant energy flow and technical support. The Zenturi ambassador remained standing, but his internal lighting had dimmed considerably. He was calculating how many of his own systems would fail during a standard power fluctuation. The galaxy's most advanced water purification technology became suddenly useless in the face of simple, reliable practicality. I watched delegates mentally reviewing their own emergency protocols, their backup systems, their contingency plans. They were all realizing the same thing. Their beautiful, efficient systems were luxury items. They were solutions for ideal conditions. Elena's messy collection of sand and charcoal was a solution for actual conditions. The difference wasn't technological sophistication. It was philosophical. One system assumed continuous civilization. The other assumed occasional collapse. And in that moment, every being in that room knew which assumption matched reality. Then she revealed they'd already called for help. The room was still absorbing the implications of the water filter demonstration when Elena shifted to another example. This one hit much closer to home for several delegates. 3 weeks ago, she said, her voice maintaining that same matter-of-fact tone, I received a communication from the Vegan High Council. She didn't elaborate on how they'd contacted her or why they'd chosen Earth. The simplicity of the statement made it more powerful. I watched the Vegan delegates stiffen. Their usually fluid, shimmering forms went rigid. Their council robes, which normally flowed with subtle energy patterns, hung motionless. This was supposed to be confidential. The atmospheric crisis had been kept completely secret from the broader galactic community. The Vegans prized their reputation for technological perfection above all else. An admission of system failure would have been devastating to their standing. Their entire atmospheric processing system had failed. Not a minor glitch or temporary fluctuation, complete cascade failure across their primary habitat domes. They were facing oxygen depletion within hours. Their backup systems, which were supposed to activate automatically, had also failed due to a design flaw they'd never anticipated. The very technology that kept them alive was suddenly killing them. Elena hadn't sent technology. She hadn't dispatched engineers or shipped replacement parts. She'd sent breathing exercises, simple techniques to maximize oxygen efficiency, methods to slow heart rates, control respiration, and conserve what little atmosphere remained. She'd transmitted data files containing exercises Earth children learn in basic survival training. That's when she said the words that made the Vegan delegates look at their own hands, as if seeing them for the first time. Sometimes knowledge is more valuable than technology, especially when technology fails. The statement hung in the air, simple and devastating. The Vegans had the most advanced atmospheric systems in the galaxy, but when those systems failed, they had nothing. No backup knowledge, no alternative methods. The Vegans had called Earth because their advanced systems had no backups. Not just mechanical backups, they had no knowledge backups. Their educational system had never taught basic atmospheric conservation because they assumed their technology would always work. Their engineers could design complex filtration systems, but they didn't know how to breathe efficiently in low-oxygen environments. Their medical experts could perform advanced surgeries, but they didn't know simple techniques to conserve oxygen during crisis situations. Their children could calculate quantum equations but couldn't conserve oxygen during a crisis. The irony was almost painful to witness. I watched the Vegan head scholar actually place a hand against his chest, as if feeling his own breathing for the first time. His people could manipulate matter at the subatomic level, but they'd forgotten how to control their own respiration when technology failed. The galaxy's most advanced civilization had been saved by techniques Earth children learned before they're 10. Basic breathing exercises, simple meditation techniques to lower metabolic rates, methods to remain calm and conserve oxygen instead of panicking and consuming it rapidly. The Vegans had survived because someone remembered that sometimes the most advanced solution is the simplest one. Their technology had failed them, but basic human knowledge had saved them. The delegates sat in silence, realizing that their pursuit of technological perfection had made them dangerously vulnerable. They'd built a civilization that could calculate the birth of stars, but couldn't breathe without machines. Then she told us about the starvation. The delegates were still processing the Vegan atmospheric crisis when Elena shifted to another example. Her delivery remained dry, factual, almost bureaucratic in its lack of emotion. The Kepler Colony Administration contacted us with temporary resource allocation challenges, she said. The understatement hung in the air. Everyone knew what temporary resource allocation challenges meant in colony terminology. It meant people were going to die. Their automated food distribution system had glitched. Not just a minor malfunction, complete systemic failure across all agricultural domes and distribution networks. 7,000 beings were facing starvation within days. The colony had enough emergency rations for 48 hours. After that, people would start dying. Their backup systems had failed. Their technical teams couldn't fix the problem. They'd built a perfect food production system with no manual override, no low-tech alternatives. Earth didn't send food. They didn't dispatch emergency ration ships. They sent instructors. 3 human teachers arrived on the next available transport, with no equipment beyond their personal bags. No advanced technology, no replacement parts, just knowledge. That's when she described how human teachers established food production systems using nothing but local resources. They identified edible native plants the colonists had dismissed as weeds. They taught hydroponic techniques using salvaged containers and simple nutrient solutions. They showed how to create composting systems from waste materials. They demonstrated food preservation methods that required no electricity. The colonists watched, initially skeptical, then increasingly desperate, then finally hopeful. I watched the Andromedans check their data slates. They were calculating how impossible this should be. Their screens showed atmospheric composition readings, soil analysis data, climate variables. According to their models, what the humans were describing shouldn't work. The colony's environment was supposedly hostile to sustainable food production without advanced technology. Their calculations assumed perfect systems. The humans assumed improvisation. Within a week, the colony was feeding itself indefinitely. No advanced technology, no imported supplies, no external support. They'd transitioned from starving to self-sufficient using knowledge instead of equipment. The human teachers didn't stay to manage the systems. They taught the colonists how to manage them, then left. The solution persisted because it belonged to the people using it. Their educational systems had taught them how to operate machines, but not how to grow food without them. The Kepler colonists could program agricultural drones and monitor automated irrigation systems. They could analyze soil samples with precision instruments. But they didn't know how to identify edible plants by sight. They couldn't create simple irrigation channels. They had no concept of seasonal planting cycles without computer guidance. They'd been educated to operate technology, not to understand the fundamental processes that technology managed. The colony survived because someone knew how to function when the perfect systems stopped being perfect. Not just survived, thrived. Their food production became more resilient, more adaptable. They'd exchanged technological dependency for practical knowledge. The human teachers hadn't just solved a temporary crisis. They'd given the colony something their advanced education had never provided: genuine self-sufficiency. The delegates sat in silence, realizing that their educational priorities had created civilizations that could build perfect systems but couldn't survive their failure. Then she explained why this matters for civilizations. The room had been absorbing the individual examples: the water filters, the atmospheric crisis, the colony rescue. But now Elena connected them into a single concept. "The funny thing about survival skills," she said, her voice cutting through the murmured discussions, "is that they scale." She paused, letting the simple statement hang in the air. The translation systems handled it easily. The concept was too fundamental to lose in translation. The same principles that help an individual survive in the wilderness help communities survive disasters. The techniques that keep one person alive during a sandstorm can protect an entire settlement. The knowledge that preserves a family during famine can sustain a nation during crop failures. The strategies that help a village withstand siege can help a civilization survive existential threats. It wasn't about complexity. It was about applicability. The fundamentals remained constant regardless of scale. I watched Chancellor Zorp Alpha actually lean forward. He'd been stoic until now, his armored plates remaining perfectly still through every previous revelation. Now his forward plates shifted, his optical sensors focusing more intently. The leader of the Galactic Educational Council was showing actual physical interest for the first time. His mandibles twitched slightly, a sign of intense concentration among his species. She wasn't talking about retreating to primitivism. She made that clear with her next statement. This isn't about abandoning technology or progress. It's about building foundations that don't collapse. Her hands moved in a simple gesture, one palm flat beneath the other, demonstrating the concept visually. Your educational systems build upward. Ours build downward first, then upward. That's when she said the words that made several delegates actually reach for their recording devices. You cannot advance in mathematics, art, or spacefaring exploration if you cannot first endure hunger, drought, disease, and siege. The statement landed with physical weight. I saw the Vegan delegates actually shiver, their robes rippling with the motion. The Zenturi engineers stopped their calculations. The Andromedan scholars put down their data slates. The room understood suddenly that their beautiful educational towers had no foundations. They'd built magnificent structures of knowledge that assumed stable ground beneath them. Elena was pointing out that the ground isn't stable, never has been. Their students could discuss quantum philosophy in 11 dimensions, but wouldn't survive the first day of a system's failure. They could compose symphonies that moved entire populations, but couldn't purify water without factory-made filters. They could design interstellar engines, but couldn't grow food without automated systems. Survival education wasn't a separate subject. It was the prerequisite for everything else they valued. Elena made this clear with her final statement on the matter. All advanced knowledge rests on basic survival. You can't have advanced mathematics if your mathematicians starve. You can't have beautiful art if your artists die in the first disaster. You can't explore the cosmos if you can't manage basic resources. The statements were simple, undeniable. The delegates looked at each other, then at their own hands, then at the human woman who had just redefined education itself. Their entire concept of learning had been built on the assumption of continuous civilization. Hers was built on the reality of occasional collapse, and in that moment everyone knew which assumption matched the universe we actually lived in. Then she questioned how we teach history. The delegates had been absorbing her examples of survival techniques when Elena shifted to something more fundamental, something that explained why her approach differed so completely from theirs. When we teach children about history, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room, we don't just tell them about the victories. The statement seemed obvious, almost trivial, until you considered what it implied. She described how Earth education includes disasters, failures, and times when everything went wrong, not as footnotes or cautionary tales, but as central components of historical study. Students learn about plagues that wiped out populations, about economic collapses that destroyed civilizations, about wars that shattered empires. They study the warning signs, the cascade failures, the moments when systems broke down. They don't just learn what worked. They learn what didn't work and why. I watched the Zenturi historian actually blush. His facial lighting shifted through several shades of embarrassment. Their historical education focused exclusively on achievements, victories, technological breakthroughs, cultural triumphs. They edited out the failures, the collapses, the dark periods. Their students learned about perfect systems that always worked, not broken systems that needed fixing. The historian's data slate showed only glowing accounts of Zenturi progress. No mention of the 3 times their civilization had nearly collapsed. That's when she said the words that made several delegates actually look at their own historical records. We teach them how societies collapse, and how they rebuild. Not just the collapse, the rebuilding. The process of starting over with limited resources, with trauma, with uncertainty. Earth students learned that civilizations aren't permanent, that they require maintenance, adaptation, and sometimes complete reconstruction. The vegan delegates looked uncomfortable. Their robes, which usually flowed with subtle energy patterns, went stiff and still. They edited out their own historical failures from educational materials. The atmospheric crisis wasn't the first time their systems had failed. It was just the first time they'd been forced to acknowledge it publicly. Their students learned about perfect environmental control, not about the times the systems had broken down and people had died. Their history was sanitized, polished, made safe. Elena's was messy, dangerous, and real. Elena's students learned from disasters. Their students only learned from successes. This created a fundamental difference in how they approached problems. Earth students expected complications. They anticipated failure points. They looked for weaknesses in systems. The Galactic students expected smooth operation. They assumed continuous progress. They looked for optimization, not vulnerability. One approach prepared them for reality. The other prepared them for ideal conditions that don't exist. I watched the Andromedan scholars checking their historical databases. They were searching for their own collapse events, their own disasters, finding them edited out or minimized. Their educational materials showed continuous advancement, not the periodic collapses and rebuilds that actually characterized their history. They'd been teaching their children a fairy tale version of their past. Elena was teaching hers the messy, complicated truth. Earth's children expected things to go wrong and knew how to respond. Their children expected things to work and were helpless when they didn't. The difference wasn't intelligence or technology. It was perspective. One educational system acknowledged the fundamental uncertainty of existence. The other pretended it didn't exist. The delegates sat in silence, realizing they'd been teaching their children a dangerous fantasy, while the humans had been teaching theirs the complicated, difficult truth. Then she mentioned the mold. Elena was discussing improvised medicine techniques when she casually mentioned penicillin production from bread mold. She didn't present it as a major revelation. She stated it as simple fact, like mentioning that water is wet or fire is hot. The medical delegates from Andromeda actually gasped. Their sterile white robes seemed to shimmer with distress. They used nano-production facilities that cost more than planetary defense systems. Their medical manufacturing required perfect sterile environments, precision calibration, and teams of specialized technicians. That's when she said the words that made the head medical officer drop his data slate. Bread mold technique works best with whole grain bread. White bread doesn't develop the right kind of mold. The specificity was devastating. She wasn't talking about theoretical improvisation. She was talking about practical details that could mean life or death. The type of bread mattered. The preparation method mattered. The conditions mattered. I watched the head medical officer frantically taking notes. His 6-fingered hands moved with uncharacteristic clumsiness. His entire pharmaceutical production system required massive infrastructure. Sterile clean rooms, precision temperature control, teams of quality assurance technicians. Elena was describing something that could be done in a kitchen with basic ingredients. The contrast was almost painful to witness. His medical education had taught him to maintain perfect systems. Hers had taught her to create solutions when no systems existed. She added another detail that made several delegates actually lean back in their seats. Also, you need to test it on a small area first to make sure you're not allergic. The safety precaution sounded so simple, so obvious. Yet it was something their advanced medical systems never considered. Their procedures assumed standardized components, controlled environments, predictable outcomes. Hers assumed variability, uncertainty, and the need for individual testing. The medical officer stopped writing and just stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The simplicity was devastating. They'd forgotten how to make medicine without factories. Their educational systems had focused so completely on advanced production that they'd lost the basic knowledge behind it. They could manage billion-credit medical manufacturing facilities but couldn't produce basic antibiotics with common materials. Their medical education assumed perfect conditions. Hers assumed collapse. Her students learned how to create medicine when the pharmacies were closed, when the factories had failed, when the supply chains had collapsed. The galaxy's most advanced medical system was suddenly vulnerable to something Earth children could create in a kitchen. I watched the Andromedan medical team having quiet, urgent conversations. Their usually perfect composure had fractured. They were realizing that all their advanced technology, all their sophisticated systems depended on conditions that don't always exist. A child with moldy bread and basic knowledge could save lives when their billion-credit facilities failed. The realization wasn't just embarrassing. It was terrifying. They'd built medical systems that could perform miracles as long as nothing went wrong. Elena taught systems that worked specifically when things went wrong. The difference wasn't just philosophical. It was practical. And in that moment, the medical delegates understood that practicality mattered more than sophistication when people were dying. Then she invited them to practice. Elena looked around the silent room, her eyes moving from delegate to delegate without judgment or expectation. The air still carried the tension of her previous revelations, the uncomfortable awareness that their educational systems had fundamental gaps. Then she spoke with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used throughout. First lesson starts in 1 hour. No request. No suggestion. Simple statement. She announced basic first aid using improvised materials. She described using clothing for bandages, straight objects for splints, common chemicals for disinfection. Then she added the detail that changed everything. We'll be practicing on each other. The words landed like physical blows. This wasn't theoretical discussion. This was physical application. Immediate, tangible, and deeply uncomfortable for most of the delegates. I watched the vegan delegates pale. Their usually shimmering forms dimmed noticeably. They weren't allowed to touch each other without proper protocols. Their culture maintained strict physical boundaries enforced by both tradition and law. Even medical treatment required extensive consent procedures and specialized interface equipment. The concept of hands-on practice with improvised materials violated decades of social conditioning. That's when she added the final instruction. Bring something to take notes with and dress comfortably. No advanced equipment. No sterile environments. No specialized interfaces. Just practical hands-on learning with whatever materials were available. The simplicity was radical. She wasn't asking them to bring medical scanners or diagnostic tools. She wanted writing materials and comfortable clothing. The contrast with their usual educational requirements couldn't have been more stark. The Zenturi ambassador actually stood up. His internal lighting flared with agitation. This is highly irregular. His voice carried the outrage of someone whose entire professional existence depended on regularity. His educational system valued procedure, protocol, and proper form above all else. What Elena proposed violated every standard they maintained. It was messy, unpredictable, and dangerously practical. Elena just smiled. Not a condescending smile, but the smile of someone stating an obvious truth. So are emergencies. 2 words that contained entire philosophies. Her response acknowledged that emergencies don't follow protocols. They don't respect procedures. They happen outside sterile environments and regular schedules. You can't schedule a crisis during convenient hours or insist it follow proper forms. Emergencies are inherently irregular, and your response must adapt accordingly. For the first time, the galactic educators were being asked to learn instead of just observe. They weren't being shown theoretical models or perfect demonstrations. They were being invited to participate in messy, imperfect, practical application. They would have to touch each other, use makeshift equipment, and operate outside their comfort zones. The shift from passive observation to active participation represented a fundamental change in their relationship with knowledge. They would have to get their hands dirty, both literally and metaphorically. The comfortable distance of theoretical education was being replaced by the immediate reality of practical application. They would have to experience learning rather than simply receiving information. The change was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Then the unexpected happened. I expected them to protest. I expected declarations of offense, statements about proper procedure, reminders of diplomatic protocols. This was beneath their dignity. These were the galaxy's foremost educators, beings who had dedicated their lives to advanced knowledge systems. Hands-on first aid with improvised materials? Practicing on each other? I prepared to document the formal complaints. Instead, the Vegan head scholar was the first to stand. His robes, which had been still with shock moments before, now flowed with purpose. He didn't look at his aides. He didn't consult his data slate. He looked directly at Elena and asked the question that changed everything. "Where is the classroom?" His voice carried no hesitation, no sense of superiority, only genuine, urgent need. That's when the stampede began. Not away from her, but toward her. The delegates didn't just stand. They moved. The Andromedan scholars abandoned their meticulous posture. The Centauri delegates ignored their internal lighting protocols. The Vegans actually pushed past their own ceremonial guards. They formed a crowd around Elena, not as critics or observers, but as students. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. I watched Chancellor Zorp Alpha actually push through his own delegates to get to the front. His armored plates scraped against each other in his haste. The leader of the Galactic Educational Council, a being who normally moved with glacial dignity, was shoving aside his own staff to reach a human woman teaching basic first aid. His optical sensors were focused entirely on Elena, his mandibles slightly parted in what I recognized as intense concentration. He wasn't observing anymore. He was participating. The Centauri engineer was asking about water filtration materials. Not advanced molecular systems, but basic sand and charcoal types. The Andromedan medic was questioning bread mold varieties, wanting to know which strains worked best for antibiotic production. Their questions weren't theoretical. They were practical, immediate, and deeply specific. They wanted details, measurements, techniques. They'd stopped caring about appearances and started caring about substance. They weren't just curious. They were desperate. I saw it in their body language, in the way they leaned forward, in the intensity of their questions. This wasn't academic interest. This was survival instinct kicking in. They'd suddenly realized their entire civilization's knowledge could vanish with one system failure. All their advanced technology, all their sophisticated systems, all their perfect procedures. They were beautiful castles built on sand. Elena had pointed out the incoming tide, and they'd finally understood the danger. The galaxy's most advanced educators were rushing to learn from the primitive human because she knew something they didn't. She knew how to survive without them. She understood that true knowledge isn't about what you can do with perfect systems, but what you can do when those systems fail. Her education wasn't about building higher towers of complexity. It was about digging deeper foundations of practicality. They'd spent centuries perfecting their castles while she'd been learning how to build shelters from whatever materials were available. And now, facing the reality that castles can collapse, they desperately needed to learn how to build shelters. Then she defined the real difference. As they gathered around her in a tight circle, their previous formality completely abandoned, Elena explained it wasn't about the specific techniques. The water filtration methods, the breathing exercises, the improvised medicine, these were just tools. The real value was something deeper, something fundamental to how humans approached existence itself. "It's about the mindset," she said, her voice carrying easily in the quiet room. "Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst." The words sounded simple, almost trivial, but in that context, after everything they'd witnessed, they carried immense weight. They weren't just words. They were a philosophy, a way of engaging with reality that acknowledged both optimism and pragmatism. I watched the Vegan scholars finally understand. Their education prepared them for the best possible outcomes. Their systems assumed optimal conditions. Their training focused on excellence within perfect parameters. Hers prepared them for reality, for the messy, unpredictable, often dangerous reality that actually exists beyond controlled environments. The difference wasn't in intelligence or capability. It was in basic assumptions about how the universe operates. That's when she said the words that made several delegates actually nod in recognition. Survival education turns disadvantages into strengths. She wasn't talking about overcoming temporary setbacks. She meant transforming fundamental weaknesses into competitive advantages. Scarcity became innovation. Danger became alertness. Limitation became creativity. Her students didn't just cope with problems. They used problems as opportunities to develop new capabilities. The Zenturi ambassador asked about their advanced technology. His voice carried genuine confusion rather than defiance. Should we abandon it? He gestured toward the glowing purification unit still sitting on the presentation table. The question represented the either-or thinking that characterized their educational approach. Perfect systems are primitive survival. No middle ground. Elena shook her head, not dismissively but patiently. Use it when it works. Know how to function when it doesn't. The statement was so reasonable it sounded revolutionary. She wasn't advocating for abandoning progress. She was advocating for maintaining basic capabilities alongside advanced systems. The two approaches weren't mutually exclusive. They were complementary, essential. The difference was fundamental. Their education assumed continuous progress. Hers assumed occasional collapse. One approach built systems that worked until they didn't. The other built systems that worked especially when other systems failed. The delegates stood there, surrounded by the physical evidence of their technological marvels, realizing that all their advancements depended on conditions that couldn't be guaranteed. The galaxy learned that day that true advancement isn't about how high you build, but how well you rebuild when things fall down. The statement hung in the air, simple and devastating. Their civilizations had focused on reaching greater heights, creating more sophisticated systems, achieving more perfect control. They'd never considered what happens when those heights crumble, when those systems fail, when that control vanishes. Elena wasn't teaching them to avoid building high. She was teaching them to build foundations that could support rebuilding, to create knowledge that persisted even when technology failed, to develop capabilities that worked in both ideal conditions and catastrophic ones. The shift in perspective was enormous. It wasn't about choosing between advanced technology and basic survival. It was about recognizing that true advancement required both, that the ability to rebuild was more important than the ability to build high, because eventually everything needs rebuilding. The delegates stood in silence, absorbing this fundamental redefinition of progress itself. Then she said the thing that silenced them completely. As the delegates gathered their note-taking materials, preparing to follow her to the practical session, one of the Andromedans asked about failure rates. His voice carried the clinical detachment of his species, the assumption that all systems have measurable inefficiencies. "How many students have you lost?" he asked, assuming even her methods must sometimes fail. It was a reasonable question from his perspective. Every educational system has attrition. Every process has failure points. It was basic statistical reality. Elena looked at him like he'd asked a strange question. Her head tilted slightly, her expression not offended but genuinely puzzled, as if he'd inquired about something that shouldn't need explaining. The Andromedan's mechanical components emitted a soft hum of confusion. He'd expected a percentage, a number, a qualified admission of imperfection. That's when she said the words that made the entire room stop moving. "Every single one of my students is still alive." The statement hung in the air, simple and devastating. No qualifications, no exceptions, just flat undeniable fact. The translation systems rendered it perfectly into every language in the room. The meaning was too fundamental to lose. I watched the statisticians check their calculations. Their data slates glowed with frantic activity. They were running probability models, calculating the astronomical odds of perfect survival across multiple crisis scenarios. The numbers didn't make sense. According to their models, what she claimed was statistically impossible. The probability was astronomical. The delegates who understood mathematics looked at each other in disbelief. But she wasn't quoting statistics. She was stating a fact. Her voice carried no pride, no boastfulness. She might have been reporting the weather. She wasn't claiming perfection. She was reporting results. The difference was important. The Andromedan stared at her, his optical sensors widening slightly. He'd asked about failure rates and received an answer that defied all his understanding of probability and risk assessment. Her students survived because they expected things to go wrong and knew how to respond. Not because they were lucky, not because they avoided danger, but because they'd been taught to anticipate problems and handle them before they became catastrophes. They didn't just know theory. They had practiced responses, muscle memory, instinctual reactions. When systems failed, they didn't panic. They adapted. When resources were scarce, they innovated. When danger appeared, they responded. In a galaxy of advanced educational systems, the human teacher had a perfect survival record. The Vegans, with their neural integration techniques, had lost students to system failures. The Zenturi, with their molecular purification systems, had fatalities during technical malfunctions. The Andromedans, with their quantum calculation academies, had casualties when reality didn't match their perfect models. Their systems were designed for ideal conditions. Hers was designed for actual conditions. The difference showed in the results, not in test scores or academic publications, but in the most important metric of all, living graduates. The room understood suddenly that all their sophisticated measurements of educational success were meaningless compared to this one simple fact. Her students survived. Theirs sometimes didn't. In that moment, no other statistic mattered. Then I saw the change happen. As the delegates moved toward the workshop spaces, I watched their body language change. They weren't walking like prestigious educators anymore. The confident strides, the ceremonial postures, the subtle displays of institutional superiority, all vanished. They moved with the purposeful urgency of students late for an important class. The transformation was complete and undeniable. The galactic educational elite had become pupils. That's when I realized Elena hadn't just taught them about survival. She'd taught them something more dangerous, something their systems had carefully eliminated from their curricula: humility. The Vegans were discussing how to incorporate breathing techniques into their primary curriculum. Their shimmering robes seemed less impressive now, more functional. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones about oxygen conservation exercises for children. The concept that their young might need to know how to breathe without technological support was revolutionary to them. The Zenturi were arguing about adding low-tech backups to their systems. Their internal lighting patterns flickered with intense debate. Engineers who had designed molecular purification systems were now discussing sand and charcoal filters. The argument wasn't about whether to include them, but how quickly they could implement them. The shift from absolute faith in technology to practical contingency planning happened in minutes, not years. The Andromedans were already planning historical disaster modules. Their data slates glowed with revised curriculum outlines. Scholars who had exclusively taught success stories were now designing courses on societal collapse and recovery. They were digging through their own historical records, finding the edited-out failures, the near catastrophes they'd conveniently forgotten. The realization that history included disasters worth studying was changing their entire approach to education. The galactic educational system wasn't just learning new skills, it was fundamentally changing its understanding of what education should be. The shift went deeper than adding a few practical courses to their curricula. It challenged the very purpose of learning itself. Education wasn't about building higher towers of knowledge anymore. It was about creating resilient foundations. The delegates understood that their previous approach had created brilliant but fragile minds. Elena's approach created adaptable, durable ones. I watched them clustering around her, not as equals discussing theory, but as students seeking guidance. The hierarchy had inverted completely. The most advanced educators in the galaxy were taking notes from a woman who taught with sand and cloth and basic knowledge. They weren't embarrassed. They were grateful. The condescension had vanished, replaced by genuine respect for practical competence. The change wasn't superficial. It was institutional, philosophical, and deeply personal. Each delegate was confronting the limitations of their own education. They were realizing that all their advanced knowledge was useless without the basic ability to adapt when systems failed. The shift from theoretical perfection to practical resilience would change their civilizations forever. They weren't just adding survival skills to their curricula. They were redefining education itself. The quiet hum of data slates being updated filled the room as centuries of educational assumptions were rewritten in real time. Then I understood why Earth sent one person. At first I thought it was arrogance. Or poverty. Maybe they couldn't afford a proper delegation. The Zenturi had brought 50 beings with specialized roles: cultural attachés, scientific advisors, technical support. The Vegans had their entire educational council. The Andromedans arrived with teams of specialists. Earth sent a single woman in practical clothing with no visible support staff. It seemed like either extreme confidence or complete disrespect for galactic protocols. Now I realized it was something else entirely. The size of the delegation wasn't about resources or status. It was about message. That's when I understood. Earth didn't need 50 delegates because they weren't presenting options. They weren't there to negotiate or compromise or discuss variations on educational theory. They were presenting a fundamental truth that didn't require debate, a reality that either existed or didn't. You either understood survival or you didn't. No amount of discussion would change the basic facts. Elena wasn't there to discuss educational theory. She was there to demonstrate educational reality. While the other delegations presented polished models and theoretical frameworks, she described children hiding from gunfire. While they showcased perfect systems operating under ideal conditions, she explained how to make antibiotics from mold. The difference wasn't in subject matter. It was in fundamental perspective. They talked about how education should work. She showed how it actually works when reality intervenes. The other delegations brought polished presentations. She brought lived experience. Their data slates showed perfect simulations. Her examples included real children in real danger using real skills to survive. Their presentations assumed continuous civilization. Hers assumed periodic collapse. They discussed ideal conditions. She discussed actual conditions. The contrast wasn't just stylistic, it was philosophical. One approach prepared students for a universe that should exist. The other prepared them for the universe that actually exists. Earth's primitive approach wasn't a lack of sophistication. It was a different kind of sophistication altogether. While the galactic educators focused on building higher towers of knowledge, Earth focused on digging deeper foundations. While they pursued perfect systems, Earth pursued resilient systems. The human advantage wasn't technological or theoretical. It was practical. They understood that the highest knowledge is useless if you can't survive to use it, that the most advanced civilization isn't the one with the best technology, but the one that survives when technology fails. The single delegate wasn't a sign of poverty or arrogance. It was the perfect representation of their educational philosophy. Effectiveness over appearance, substance over ceremony, survival over spectacle. They didn't need 50 people to deliver their message because their message was simple, undeniable, and required no embellishment. The truth rarely does. Then the room emptied and I was alone with the silence. The grand chamber felt different after they left. Not just empty of bodies, but empty of pretense. The air itself seemed clearer, as if the collective anxiety of performance had dissipated. The space felt more substantial, too, weighted with the new understanding that had settled over everyone. The polished floors and gleaming walls looked the same, but they meant something different now. I looked at the abandoned Zenturi purification system, still glowing on the presentation table. Its blue lights pulsed rhythmically, a perfect metronome of technological confidence. The hum was so quiet I could barely hear it. 20,000 credits worth of engineering, designed by the finest minds in the galaxy. It represented centuries of progress, of refinement, of perfecting systems until they operated with flawless precision. And it was completely alone on that table. That's when I noticed Elena's homemade filter sitting beside it. Simple, messy, effective. The sand had settled into uneven layers. A bit of charcoal dust smudged the plastic container. The cloth wrapper looked frayed at one corner. It cost 2 credits, maybe less. It didn't glow. It didn't hum. It just sat there, doing what it was designed to do without ceremony or spectacle. The contrast wasn't just between 2 filtration systems. It was between 2 philosophies of existence. I realized the galaxy's educational systems had been building beautiful towers without foundations. We'd created magnificent structures of knowledge that reached incredible heights, but they rested on assumptions that couldn't support their weight. The slightest tremor of reality would topple them. The Zenturi system needed perfect power, perfect maintenance, perfect conditions. Elena's filter needed gravity and patience. One required an entire civilization to support it. The other required a container and some basic materials. Elena hadn't brought a taller tower. She'd brought a shovel. She wasn't here to compete in the construction of increasingly sophisticated systems. She was here to dig down to the bedrock of what actually keeps people alive. Her presentation wasn't about adding another level to our educational structures. It was about checking if the ground beneath them was solid. The delegates had come to discuss roof ornamentation. She'd asked about the foundation. The silence wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was the sound of revaluation. The quiet hum of the Zenturi system seemed louder now. Not because the volume had changed, but because everything else had fallen away. The pretense, the posturing, the assumptions. What remained was the simple reality of two devices on a table, and the understanding that one worked in more conditions than the other. The silence was the sound of centuries of educational philosophy being re-examined from the ground up. They weren't just learning survival skills. They were learning how much they didn't know. The stampede toward the workshop wasn't about acquiring new techniques. It was about confronting fundamental gaps in their understanding. They'd mastered quantum mechanics but couldn't purify water without factory-made filters. They could calculate orbital trajectories but didn't know how to breathe efficiently during an atmospheric crisis. The realization was humbling, but it was also liberating. They were finally learning something that mattered. The quietest moment in galactic educational history was also the moment we started actually learning, not just accumulating information, not just perfecting systems, but understanding what knowledge actually means when the systems fail. The delegates had left the chamber not as experts, but as students. They'd abandoned their polished presentations for messy, practical learning. The chamber was empty, but education was finally happening. The real work had moved to the workshops, where people were getting their hands dirty with sand and charcoal and basic truths. The silence wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something real. Then I saw the pattern everywhere. As I reviewed the summit recordings later that night, I noticed something I'd missed during the live proceedings. The patterns weren't just in the current educational approaches. They were historical, buried, deliberately overlooked. Every advanced civilization in that room had experienced near-collapse events they'd systematically edited from their educational materials. The evidence was there in the archival footage, the historical records, the cultural memory gaps. The Vegans had ancient techniques for oxygen conservation they'd forgotten. Their ancestors survived atmospheric fluctuations using breathing methods and communal resource sharing. These practices were documented in their early historical texts, but disappeared from educational curricula once their environmental systems became automated. They'd traded practical knowledge for technological dependency, without realizing they were losing essential survival capabilities. The very skills that saved them during their recent crisis were skills their own ancestors had mastered. The Zenturi had historical knowledge of low-tech purification they'd discarded. Their colonial expansion period included detailed manuals on sand filtration, chemical neutralization using local minerals, and emergency water sourcing. These manuals were celebrated as historical artifacts, but removed from active educational use once their advanced purification systems came online. They'd preserved the documents but lost the living knowledge. The techniques became museum pieces instead of practical skills. The Andromedans had disaster recovery protocols they'd considered obsolete. Their mechanical civilization maintained extensive records of manual system overrides, redundant mechanical backups, and failure mode operations from their pre-digital era. These protocols were still technically available in their archives, but hadn't been taught to engineers in generations. They assumed automated systems would always function, rendering the old knowledge unnecessary. That's when I understood. Elena wasn't just teaching Earth's survival methods. She was teaching them how to remember their own. Her presentation acted as a catalyst, triggering recognition of lost capabilities. The delegates weren't learning entirely new concepts. They were rediscovering what their civilizations had known but forgotten. The enthusiasm wasn't just about acquiring human knowledge. It was about reclaiming their own heritage. Survival education wasn't about becoming human. It was about remembering how to be whatever you were when things go wrong. The realization changed everything. This wasn't cultural imposition. It was cultural rediscovery. The vegan breathing techniques weren't human inventions. They were rediscovered vegan practices. The Zenturi water purification methods weren't human innovations. They were reclaimed Zenturi knowledge. The Andromedan disaster protocols weren't human concepts. They were recovered Andromedan procedures. Elena's role wasn't to teach them new things. It was to help them remember old things. Her examples served as mirrors reflecting their own forgotten capabilities. The stampede to learn wasn't about adopting human ways. It was about reconnecting with their own survival heritage. They weren't becoming more human. They were becoming more themselves. Just versions of themselves that could survive when technology failed. The galactic educational shift wasn't about importing foreign knowledge. It was about reintegrating lost wisdom. The delegates left that chamber not as converts to human philosophy, but as rediscoverers of their own practical heritage. They weren't adding human skills to their curricula. They were restoring their own foundational knowledge to its proper place. The survival mindset wasn't a human invention. It was a universal requirement that they'd temporarily forgotten. Elena hadn't brought them something new. She'd reminded them of something essential. Then I finally understood her purpose. After the chamber emptied, I pulled up Elena's Earth educational credentials. The records showed impressive qualifications, but not in the way the galaxy valued. She held advanced degrees in emergency response systems and environmental adaptation. Her certifications included disaster management and resource conservation. None of the standard galactic educational metrics applied to her profile. She didn't fit their measurement systems because she operated outside their framework entirely. She hadn't published papers on educational theory. Her publications consisted of field manuals on practical survival, technical guides on water purification in contaminated environments, manuals on emergency shelter construction, handbooks on improvised medical procedures. While galactic educators were writing treatises on quantum learning paradigms, she was documenting how to build a fire without matches or purify water using sunlight. The difference wasn't in intelligence or dedication. It was in fundamental priorities. That's when I realized the galaxy defined education as knowledge transmission. They measured success by information retention, theoretical understanding, and academic publication. She defined it as capability development. Her metrics were survival rates, problem-solving effectiveness, and adaptive capacity. Their systems produced scholars who could discuss ideas in perfect conditions. Hers produced people who could solve problems in imperfect conditions. The distinction was fundamental and profound. The difference wasn't in intelligence. It was in application. Galactic students could discuss complex concepts but couldn't apply them outside controlled environments. Elena's students might not discuss theory as eloquently, but they could implement solutions with whatever materials were available. One approach valued talking about doing, the other valued actual doing. Both required intelligence but applied that intelligence to different ends. Their education assumed continuous civilization. It prepared students for a world that functioned properly, where systems worked as designed, where resources were always available. Hers assumed occasional collapse and necessary rebuilding. It prepared students for a world where things break, where systems fail, where resources become scarce. One prepared for ideal conditions. The other prepared for actual conditions. Both were right in their assumptions about different aspects of existence. Civilizations do experience periods of stability and progress. They also experience collapse and rebuilding. But only one approach was useful when things actually went wrong. When systems failed, when disasters struck, when the comfortable assumptions proved false. Theoretical knowledge became worthless without practical application. Discussion became irrelevant without action. The Galactic Educational Summit learned that day that true education isn't about what you know, it's about what you can do with what you have when everything goes wrong. The realization changed everything. Success wasn't measured by examination scores or publication counts anymore. It was measured by survival rates and problem-solving effectiveness. The delegates understood that their educational priorities had been backward. They'd been building beautiful minds without ensuring those minds could function in the real world. Elena hadn't brought a new educational theory. She'd brought a fundamental redefinition of education itself. The shift wasn't about adding survival skills to existing curricula. It was about making survival skills the foundation of all education. You couldn't build advanced knowledge on shaky foundations. You needed certainty that the basics were covered first, that students could survive, adapt, and rebuild before they learned to theorize, analyze, and perfect. The quiet chamber felt different now. The gleaming presentation table, the advanced technology, the perfect systems, they all looked like beautiful ornaments on a structure that might collapse at any moment. Elena's simple filter sat beside the advanced purification unit. a silent reminder that sometimes the simplest solution is the most reliable. The delegates had left to learn practical skills, but they'd also left with a new understanding of what education should be. Not preparation for ideal conditions, but preparation for reality. However messy that reality might be, the galaxy thought education was about building higher. Elena Vasquez taught us it's about building deeper foundations first. Remember this. The most advanced civilization isn't the one with the best technology, but the one that survives when technology fails completely. Now ask yourself honestly, what would happen if everything went wrong tomorrow? Would you know how to find water, secure shelter, or help others survive? Your answer determines your real education, not what you know in theory, but what you can actually do when nothing works as intended. That's the only education that matters.